Winston Brown was driving to Texas without a clear reason. There was no case, no client, no letter asking for help. There was only a thought that suddenly appeared and wouldn't go away. He needed to go. He couldn't explain why. Every time he tried to distract himself, the thought returned, like a quiet knock on the door that only you can hear. The road stretched on endlessly. The further he drove, the fewer gas stations he encountered, and the stranger the landscape became. The land looked parched, but not dead, rather wary, as if watching. The sky was too clear, without a single cloud, and this made the space around him unreal, flat, like a stage set. The radio only worked on one wavelength. The announcer's voice was calm and emotionless, but Winston quickly realized that the messages were repeated word for word every 20 minutes. At one point, the announcer said something that made Winston involuntarily slow down. If you're driving and can't remember why, then you're almost there. He turned off the radio. The silence in the car became oppressive, as if it filled the entire cabin. The first town he entered was called San Moro. The name seemed strangely familiar, although Winston was sure he had never heard of it. The city was alive. Shops were open. Cars were driving. People were walking the streets. But they all moved too synchronously, as if adjusting to an invisible rhythm. At the motel, the receptionist looked at Winston for a long time before handing over the key. "Are you staying long?" he asked. "I don't know," Winston answered honestly. The receptionist nodded, as if he had heard the correct answer. That night, Winston woke up with the feeling that someone was standing at the window. He couldn't see the figure, but he felt their gaze. When he abruptly turned on the light, the room was empty. However, the curtains swayed slightly, although the windows were closed. He noticed a mark on the glass, a palm print pointing outward, as if someone had pressed their hand, trying to get out. The next day, Winston began asking questions. People answered politely but evasively. They talked about the weather, the road, the price of gas. But as soon as he asked how long they had lived there, the conversation ended. Some simply left mid-sentence. He noticed another oddity. There was no cemetery in the town, neither old nor new. That evening, Winston went into a bar. It was quiet. Several people were sitting at the counter, looking into their glasses. One of them, a man of about 40 with tired eyes, spoke first. "You're not from here. Is it noticeable?" Winston asked. "Those from here don't ask questions," the man replied. "And they don't look around so carefully. What happens to those who look?" The man slowly turned to him. "They begin to see that the town doesn't let you go." He explained that San Moro is a place where people stop by chance, or they think it's by chance. Some stay for a day, some for years, and some leave, but not completely. "Have you noticed," he continued, "that you have trouble remembering the road you took?" Winston strained. He tried to imagine the route, and realized that he saw it in fragments, as if pieces cut out. That night, Winston heard footsteps again, this time in the motel hallway. They stopped at every door. At his, they lingered the longest. There was a soft knock. "Winston," said a voice outside, "you've been here before." "We don't know each other," he said without opening the door. "You always say that," the voice replied, "the first few times." In the morning, Winston found a key on the nightstand. Not for his room. The key fob said, "Room 0. There was no such room in the motel. He found a door at the end of the hallway, where he was sure there used to be a wall. The door opened without a creak. Behind it wasn't a number, but a street, the same one he'd walked along during the day. He realized the city isn't limited by space. It's within. Winston left San Moro at dawn, or so it seemed to him. He drove for a long time, without stopping, until the city disappeared from the mirrors. Only then could he breathe normally. A few hours later, he stopped at a gas station and went inside. A map of Texas hung on the wall. Winston walked closer and froze. San Moro wasn't on the map, but on his hand, just above the wrist, there was a thin mark, as if from an old key that had been clutched in his palm for a long time. Sometimes Winston catches himself thinking about the way back, not because he wants to, but because something is waiting for him to forget why he's driving again. And Texas is patient. Winston Brown was sure he had left San Moro forever. He repeated this to himself every time he caught a glimpse of the deserted landscape outside the window and felt the tension gradually ease. The world became normal again. Gas stations with bright signs, truckers, the smell of coffee and gasoline, casual conversations. But the calm was fragile, like thin glass, and Winston felt it in his skin. The problem was his memory. It had begun to behave strangely. Some days seemed to blur together. He would stop for the night, go to bed, and wake up far down the highway, with no memory of driving that stretch. The car was fine. The tank was full. The receipts were in the glove compartment, but the actual trips between the points slipped his mind, as if someone had carefully cut them out with scissors. One day, he noticed that the receipts from different places kept repeating the same time, 2:17 a.m. Always, even if he was sure he had stopped by during the day. Winston tried to reconstruct the route, laying out maps on the table at a roadside motel, but the lines didn't form a logical path. They converged in one area, where the map showed only emptiness. That night, he heard someone talking on the phone in the next room. The voice was muffled, but familiar. Too familiar. Winston listened closely and realized he was hearing his own intonations, as if someone had been rehearsing his speech, copying the pauses and breathing. He went out into the hallway. The door of the next room was ajar. The light was on inside, but the room was empty. A notebook lay on the bed. On the first page, written in neat handwriting, was the words, "You're already late." Then came the notes, descriptions of cities, roads, motels. Winston recognized some. Some he saw for the first time. But the scariest part was at the end. The notes ended with words he often spoken out loud. He burned the notebook in the parking lot, watching the paper turn black and curl. But the feeling of an alien presence didn't disappear. On the contrary, it grew closer, as if he no longer needed to hide. 2 days later, Winston turned off the highway onto a road that wasn't listed in any GPS. He couldn't remember the moment he made this decision. He simply noticed he was driving on a narrow strip of asphalt, surrounded by dry earth and the occasional post with faded signs. One of them read, "Local traffic only." He was sure he wasn't a local. The road led him to a small settlement with no name. A few houses, a store, a school with boarded-up windows. Everything looked abandoned, but the traces of life were fresh. Warm ashes in a barrel, tire tracks, a warm light behind the curtains of one of the houses. A woman of about 50 came out of the store. She looked at Winston as if she had been expecting him. "You're early again," she said. "We don't know each other," he replied. "You always say that." The woman smiled slightly. "Come on in before the sun sets." "Where to?" "While there's still a choice." He stayed, not because he wanted to, but because he understood that if he went any further, he would lose a piece of himself again. Time behaved differently in this place. It slowed down, allowing one to think. But this came at the price of attention. The moment one was distracted, reality began to float. Sounds lingered. Shadows moved in the wrong direction. The inhabitants of the settlement rarely spoke of the past. But Winston noticed that they all had the same look in their eyes, wary, as if they were constantly listening to something inside themselves. A man told him one night by the fire, "Texas isn't a state. It's a corridor. Some people go through it quickly. Some get stuck, and some become part of the walls. What about you? Winston asked. The man was silent for a long time. I'm not sure I'm moving anymore. On the third day, Winston realized that if he stayed any longer, he would no longer be able to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. He said goodbye and left before dawn. The woman from the store stood by the road and watched him go. Don't forget the way back, she said. That's the most dangerous thing. A few hours later, Winston found himself back on the highway. The world was noisy and alive, but in the reflection of the side mirror, for a moment, he saw a sign without a name that shouldn't have been there. Now Winston knows. The journey to Texas doesn't end. It just changes speed. Sometimes the road leads him forward. Sometimes it leads inward. And every time he thinks he's figured it out, the state again becomes too big, too quiet, and too attentive. And somewhere between the cities, someone continued to record his journey, carefully, without errors, as if preparing to pass it on. After he returned to the main road, Winston Brown tried to convince himself that it was all over. He even turned on music, loud, sharp, lively, to drown out his thoughts. But the music didn't sound as it should have. There were short pauses between tracks, and in these pauses he heard not silence, but anticipation, as if someone was listening with him, waiting for the moment to speak. He began recording everything into a tape recorder, not like a detective, like a man afraid of losing himself. He recited the date, time, place, weather, his name. At first, it helped. Then he noticed that sometimes the tape recorder turned on by itself, and when he listened to recordings, he found fragments he didn't remember. In one of them, he said in a tired voice, "If you hear this, it means you've already gone too far. Don't argue with the road. Don't try to outsmart her." Winston turned off the recording and stared at the dashboard for a long time. He couldn't remember when or where he'd said that. At the next gas station, he met a man in a traffic police uniform. He was standing by the sign, smoking, looking not at the road but somewhere into space. "You're not the first," the man said without turning his head. "The first of what?" "The one who thinks he's still driving himself." Winston felt a chill under his skin. "Have you worked here long?" "Long enough to." "Stop counting the days," the man replied. "The road counts for me." He pointed to the sign. Winston looked closely and realized that the arrow on it was shaking slightly, as if it couldn't choose a direction. Further on, there were sections that Winston couldn't describe. He passed towns where the names were erased right before his eyes. There were signs, but the letters on them were blurring, as if they were forgotten faster than the paint had time to dry. In one such place, he stopped for the night and discovered that the motel room had no mirrors. Not a single one. Not even in the bathroom. The receptionist said it was safer. That night, Winston woke up to someone sitting in the chair next to his bed. He couldn't see the figure, but he heard breathing, even calm, like that of someone who had lived there for a long time. "You become slower," the voice said. "You used to leave faster." "Have we met?" Winston asked. "You remember me under different names," the voice answered. "Sometimes as a road, sometimes as a mistake." When the light came on, the chair was empty, but there were footprints on the floor, leading to the door and ending in the middle of the room. With each passing day, Winston found himself more and more reluctant to leave, not because he liked these places. On the contrary, they frightened him, but the fear had become familiar. And familiar fear is the most dangerous of all. It lulls you, makes you consider a part of yourself. In one town, he met a woman who recognized his name, although he did not introduce himself. "You pass through again," she said. "Always alone, and always thinking it's the last time." "And you," he asked, "are you passing through too?" The woman shook her head. "I stopped once. Now I help others not pretend they are in control. She gave him a hand-drawn map. There were no roads on it, only marks and short phrases. Don't turn here. Don't stop here. If you hear your name, speed up. The map helped, but not for long. One morning, Winston realized he could no longer remember where this trip had begun. He remembered the road, the cities, the faces, the fear, but not the starting point. This realization hit him harder than anything else. If there is no beginning, then where is the end? He pulled to the side of the road, got out of the car, and looked at the horizon. Texas was everywhere. In the sky, in the ground, in the space between thoughts. It wasn't a place. It was a state you enter when you walk forward for too long, without looking back. Winston got back in the car and turned on the recorder again. My name is Winston Brown, he said firmly. I'm driving because I want to return, even if I don't remember where. For a second, it seemed like the road beneath his wheels had smoothed out, as if it had heard him. But somewhere ahead, the next fork in the road awaited. And Winston knew. Each of them remembered his choices better than he did. A few hours after Winston started driving again, he noticed that cars were appearing around him too regularly. The same pickup truck had passed him 3 times, then a 4th. Each time, the driver didn't look in Winston's direction, but Winston was sure he was being seen, not with their eyes. Like a route, he took the nearest exit and found himself at a roadside diner with a faded sign that read June's Diner. The place looked ordinary, almost cozy. That's what had alerted him. Inside, it smelled of coffee and something sweet. Behind the counter stood a woman of about 60 with short gray hair. She placed a mug in front of him before he could even order. You look like the road is holding you back, she said calmly. I didn't order anything. I know, she replied. You always get black. When you still remember who you are. Those words stung more than he expected. In the far corner sat a young man, too neatly dressed for this place. He was doodling something in a notebook. As Winston passed, he caught a glimpse of the drawing, a road disappearing into itself. Don't stare for too long, the man said, without looking up. Then you'll start recognizing the turns. His name was Caleb. He said he'd hitchhiked more than once, but each time he found himself further and further from where he started. I thought I was just lost, he said. Then I realized I'd been abandoned, like a bookmark in a book. June listened to them silently, wiping down the counter. Some people are passengers, she said finally. Some are signs, and some, she looked at Winston, become part of the road, even if they don't want to. Later, another man came into the cafe. A tall man with a weathered face, wearing an old road service jacket. He didn't say hello, but simply sat down next to Winston. You've been going strong for a long time, he said. Usually after San Moro, people either come back or stop asking. Who are you? Winston asked. My name is Earl, the man replied. I fix things that break when someone goes the wrong way. Roads. People, Earl said, looking him straight in the eyes for the first time. When Winston left the cafe, the sun was already setting. Caleb decided to go with him. June waved at them and said one last thing. If you hear a knock under the hood, don't stop. It's not a car. They drove in silence. After a while, Caleb spoke up. Have you ever noticed how sometimes it feels like you've already had this conversation? Winston nodded. I sometimes think we're gone, Caleb continued, that we're just repeating. And that's when the car stalled. Silence fell upon them abruptly, too abruptly. People emerged from the darkness ahead, several figures. They stood along the road, not coming any closer. Their faces were blurred, as if Winston were looking at them through fogged-up glass. Don't come out, Caleb whispered. "This isn't help." One of the people took a step forward. "Winston," he said in a strange but familiar voice. "You chose wrong again." Winston realized the voice belonged to himself. Not a reflection, not a recording, but a version that was left somewhere earlier. Suddenly the headlights flashed on. A pickup truck, the same one, stopped next to him. Earl was behind the wheel. "Quickly," he said, "before they remember you're here." The car started on the first try, as if it had never stalled. When Winston looked back, the road was empty. No figures, no tracks. They stopped well after midnight. Earl got out of the car and lit a cigarette. "You can't drive forever," he said. "Sooner or later the road will demand a toll." "What?" Winston asked. Earl shrugged. "A name, a memory, or someone nearby." Caleb turned pale. "I don't want to stay," he said. Earl looked at him carefully. "Then don't look back when you get out." After a few miles, Caleb asked to stop. He got out without saying goodbye and walked into the darkness without looking back. The road swallowed his steps almost immediately. Winston was alone. Since then, he has seen more and more familiar faces in unfamiliar places. Sometimes he thinks June is looking at him from the windows of gas stations. Sometimes he hears Caleb's voice in the noise of the tires. Sometimes it seems to him that Earl is driving somewhere behind, maintaining a distance. The ride continues, and Winston begins to understand the most terrible thing. Texas is not a trap. It is a selection, and the road has not yet decided who Winston will ultimately become. After Caleb disappeared into the darkness, Winston Brown couldn't bring himself to step on the gas again for a long time. The car stood in the middle of the road, the headlights illuminating the emptiness, and this emptiness seemed too attentive. He felt that if he turned off the engine, the road would take a step towards him. Not a physical one, but an internal one. He drove. The further he drove, the more often he caught himself on a strange sensation. He was no longer alone, even when there was no one around. It was like the presence of a passenger you don't see, but constantly consider. You don't turn sharply, you don't speak out loud, you don't think through it. At the next stop, Winston noticed something new. People. There were few of them, but each of them looked as if they had come here from another time. A man in an old shirt that was long out of style. A girl with a phone whose model Winston couldn't remember. An elderly woman holding a key, the only one, without a fob. All of them looked not at him, but through him. At the gas station, the cashier scanned the purchase and suddenly frowned. "That's strange," he said. "What exactly?" "You've already paid." "When?" "Earlier." The cashier fell silent, as if the word had stuck. "Not today." Winston walked out with the receipt in his hand and noticed the date. It was tomorrow. That night, he stayed at a motel that wasn't listed on any map. The room was clean, too clean, as if it had never been used. There was a Bible on the nightstand, but tucked between the pages were sheets of paper, written on, faded. They were letters. They all began the same way. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't have time." And they were all signed with different names, but the style was the same. His. Winston read and felt a chill rise inside. The letters talked about roads, about nameless cities, about people who first help and then become part of the route. One of the letters read, "The worst thing is not to lose yourself. The worst thing is to become convenient." He didn't remember writing it, but he knew he could. That night, he heard someone walking around the room, although the door was locked. The steps were slow, cautious, as if whoever was walking was exploring the space. Winston didn't move, didn't breathe. He realized if he gave a sign, he would be noticed completely. "You've been driving too long," said the voice. "We're starting to lose you." "Who, we?" Winston asked, not understanding why. those who are waiting, those who left, those who still think they can come back. In the morning, the motel was gone. Winston walked out and found himself in an empty parking lot. No building, no road back, only the highway forward. He began to see signs that didn't exist, warnings without text, signs without directions. Sometimes they move in the wind, although there was no wind. Sometimes he caught himself reading inscriptions that weren't there, but he understood the meaning immediately. One of these signs read, "Stopping is more dangerous than going on." Towards evening, Winston saw people standing along the road. They weren't waving. They were just standing. Their faces were calm, almost empty. He realized that these were people who had once stopped. One of the figures took a step forward. "Winston," she said, "we are here." "Because you passed by." And he recognized Caleb's voice. "You promised not to look back," Winston whispered. "I never looked back," the voice replied. "I just stayed." Winston closed his eyes and stepped on the gas. From then on, the road became personal. It began to respond to his thoughts. When he doubted, forks appeared. When he remembered the past, the radio picked up old songs he hadn't heard in a long time. When he thought about stopping, the engine began to behave strangely, as if warning him. And the worst thing was that Winston began to understand. The road didn't want to destroy him. It wanted him to come closer, so that he would become the one who explains to others how to drive, the one who appears in cafes, at gas stations in the dark, and says the right words, the one who no longer looks for the exit, because he himself has become part of the path. Sometimes Winston catches his reflection in the glass, and it smiles before he does. Sometimes he hears someone say his name with gratitude. Sometimes it seems to him that he already stopped once, and just doesn't remember it. But while he was driving, the world still held together, because the road was patient, and it could wait until a person got tired of being human. He didn't understand this right away. At first, there were little things, coincidences that were too precise, pauses that were too perfect. Winston caught himself knowing what a person would say before they opened their mouth. He knew where a pothole would be, where the radio would hiss, where the next random exit would appear. Not intuition. Experience he shouldn't have had. One night, he stopped at a gas station he was sure he'd seen before. The same peeling pump, the same light, trembling like a tired heart. Only now there was a man standing next to him. A man of about 50. Calm. Too calm. He sat on the curb, looking at the road, and didn't turn around when Winston approached. "You're late," the man said. "Have we met?" "You know the answer." Winston sat down next to him. He immediately understood. This man had been here for a long time. Not in body, but in role. "What's your name?" Winston asked. The man chuckled. "My name used to be Aaron. Then it changed. It doesn't matter now." "What are you doing here?" Aaron looked at the road as if he were looking at a living creature, holding it, guiding it, explaining to those who still think they're driving on their own. Winston felt his insides tighten. "Is it temporary?" "That's what everyone thinks," Aaron answered, "until you realize that the road doesn't like a vacuum." He stood up and looked Winston in the eyes for the first time. "I'm tired." The word sounded not like complaint, but like a judgment. "You think the road catches people," Aaron continued. "In fact, it replaces them. When someone can't cope anymore, another one appears. Someone who has been driving longer than the others. Someone who still resists." "I won't stay," Winston said. Aaron nodded. "I said so too." Winston didn't sleep that night. He sat in the car and felt the road slowing down. Not around him, but inside him. His thoughts became viscous. Memories became confused. He began to forget the faces of people he had met before. But he clearly remembered those he had seen on the road, those who had taken a wrong turn, those who had stopped. Towards morning, Aaron disappeared. In his place remained a road service jacket and a key. The same one, the one without a fob. Winston didn't want to take it, but the key ended up in his pocket. After that, the world began to behave differently. People began to turn to Winston for help, without even understanding why. "Tell me, is this the right exit? Have you been driving here long?" "I think I've been here before," he answered automatically. And each time, he felt something fall into place. He began to appear where he was needed, in cafes, at gas stations, on the dark shoulders of the road. Sometimes he saw fear in people's eyes and said exactly the words that kept them from stopping, or conversely made them stay. The worst thing happened when he saw Earl, the same one, the pickup, the jacket, the same look. "So it's you now," Earl said calmly. "Did you know?" "I saw the way the road looked at you," he replied. "It's rarely wrong." "And Aaron?" "Gone," Earl said, "or became the one who waits further." They stood in silence. "You still have time," Earl added, "as long as you doubt." It was then that Winston realized doubt is the only thing keeping him human, but doubt is fading, slowly, almost imperceptibly. One day he caught himself thinking that he no longer remembered where he started. The name Winston Brown was still with him, but it sounded like a position, not a person. He began to say "we," meaning the road. He began to feel irritated when someone drove wrong. The final push came at night, when a guy approached him confused, scared. "I don't know where I am," he said. "I think I should have gone home." Winston looked at him and saw himself, the early one, the one who still thought the trip was over. He understood this was it, the moment of replacement. If he said the right words, the guy would leave. If not, he would stay. Winston opened his mouth and fell silent, because for the first time in a long time, he understood. If he made this choice, there would be no turning back. Roads. And waited, quietly, patiently. As always, Winston stood in front of the guy for too long. The silence stretched out, became viscous, sticky like thick fog. The road around seemed to cease to be a road. It turned into a waiting corridor. Even the wind did not move the dust. The world froze, waiting to hear the answer. The guy swallowed nervously. You work here?" he asked uncertainly. "It's just, you look like you know where to go." These words hit harder than any confession. You work. You know. Winston felt something quietly click inside, like a lock that had been locked for a long time. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mark." The guy answered. "I was going to see my sister, the navigator. It started driving strangely, and then I ended up here." Winston nodded. He had heard this story before. More than once. Too many times. Before, he listened to it as a witness. Now, as a person who knows a continuation. "You're tired," Winston said. "Yes." Mark breathed a sigh of relief. "Very. It's normal," Winston continued. "The road here is like that. It tests how confident you are in where you're going." The words came out on their own, without effort, without a doubt. And that was the scariest thing. Mark looked at him hopefully. "Will I be able to get out?" Winston felt the road tense. Not a sound, not movement, pressure, as if someone was standing very close behind him. "Yes," he said, "but you need to go straight. Don't turn. And if you see a light, don't stop." These were the right words. He knew it with frightening certainty. Mark smiled, thanked him, got in the car, drove away. The road relaxed, and Winston realized he had just made his first change. After that, everything changed faster. People began to appear more often, sometimes one at a time, sometimes several at once. Winston was no longer surprised when he knew what they would say. He began to guess their fears by the way they walked, by the way they held the wheel, by the way they looked at the horizon. He no longer looked for a place to stay. Motels found themselves along his path. Cafes opened when he was hungry. Gas stations when the tank was running low. The world was adjusting, and there was something deeply wrong and frighteningly convenient about it. Sometimes he saw Aaron, indirectly, in reflections, in glass, in the dark windows of closed stores. Aaron watched calmly, even gratefully. One day, Winston heard Earl's voice on the radio. "Don't keep them too long," the voice said through the static. "The road doesn't like it when you argue with it." "I'm not arguing," Winston said out loud. "You still remember what an argument is?" The voice replied, "It won't last long." That night, Winston caught himself no longer calling himself by his name. A name had become something external, like a car number or the color of a jacket. He increasingly thought of himself as a function, like a point through which they pass. That wasn't the scariest thing. The scariest thing was that he began to understand the road, not metaphorically. He sensed its intentions, where it wanted to detain a person, where to let him go, where to replace him. One day, a woman with a child approached him. The child was silent and looked straight at Winston without blinking. "He hasn't spoken since we left the highway," the woman said. "Do you know what to do?" Winston looked into the child's eyes and saw an emptiness too deep for his age. He understood. This child already heard the road. "Go," Winston said quietly, "and don't stop again, even if he asks." The woman nodded without asking questions. They drove away. The child smiled. After that, Winston stood alone for a long time. He felt something inside him cracking. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. The last layer. He tried to remember home. It didn't work. He tried to remember his friend's face. Empty. He tried to remember who he was before the trip, and realized he couldn't pinpoint where it had begun. Then, for the first time in a long time, he felt truly afraid. He got into the car and covered his face with his hands. "I didn't agree," he whispered. "You didn't refuse," the road answered. The voice wasn't outside. It was inside his thoughts. "How much longer?" Winston asked. "As long as you're needed," the road answered, "or until someone better comes along." Winston slowly lowered his hands. He realized that the worst was yet to come, the moment when he would stop waiting for a replacement and start looking for one himself. And somewhere far away, on an empty highway, a man was already driving who didn't yet know why he was heading to Texas. He began to notice new people before they appeared. First as a sensation, a slight pressure in his chest, like before a thunderstorm. Then as a thought that wasn't his. Soon, and only then did a car appear on the horizon, always alone, always driving uncertainly. Winston was no longer surprised. He'd step out onto the side of the road even before the driver stopped. Sometimes people would ask how he knew they were there. Sometimes they wouldn't. Most often, they simply accepted his presence as logical, the same way one accepts pain when it lasts too long. Over time, Winston realized the road teaches him, but not words or actions. It teaches selection. He began to distinguish between those who would be able to leave and those who wouldn't. It wasn't by actions, not by courage, not by intelligence. It was deeper, by how a person reacts to silence. Those who started talking to fill it stayed. Those who remained silent and listened sometimes left. One day, he met a woman named Lena. She wasn't scared. This immediately alerted him. "You don't look lost," Winston said. "Because I know I'm being led," she replied. "I'm just not sure where." She looked at the road not as a threat, but as an interlocutor. Winston felt a chill. Such people were the road's favorite. "You can already hear her," he said. Yes, Lena nodded. But she's lying. These words sound like a crack in the world. She always lies, Lena continued. She says she maintains order, that she doesn't let the emptiness creep in. But in reality, she's afraid of being alone. For the first time in a long time, Winston didn't know what to answer. You're not the first, Lena said more quietly, and not the last. But you're the first who still remembers that it's okay to disobey. Then why are you here? He asked. Lena looked at him for a long moment, almost with regret. Because I have to see if the one standing between us will break down. After that conversation, the road became more aggressive. Signs appeared abruptly. Cars stalled for no apparent reason. The radio turned on by itself, and in the static, he could hear phrases Winston had spoken before to other people in other places. Once he heard his own voice say, "If you turn now, you won't come back." He couldn't remember who he'd said that to. And then what he'd feared most happened. He began to wait. Not to wait for the end. To wait for a replacement. And there was something wrong, almost joyful, about this waiting. The thought that someone else would take on the weight of the road brought relief. Winston found himself evaluating people no longer as travelers, but as candidates. One night, he saw a car driving too smoothly, too confidently. The driver didn't hesitate on a single turn. Winston felt the familiar squeeze in his chest. But this time it was different, sharp, personal. When the car stopped, a man of about 30 got out, tired but attentive. He looked around and immediately looked straight at Winston. "I knew you'd be here," he said. "Have we met?" Winston asked, although he already knew the answer. "Not yet," the man replied. "But you've spoken to me many times, just not here." His name was Noah, and Winston understood this wasn't just any traveler. This was the next one. The road stood still. Even the wind died down. Winston felt everything inside him resist and simultaneously pull him forward. If he took a step now, the process would begin. Not immediately, slowly, but irreversibly. "You're tired," Noah said, looking at him intently. "I can see it." Winston was silent. "I once thought I was moving of my own free will, too," Noah continued. "But you helped me stay on track. You said the right words. Those words cut like a knife." "I didn't want to," Winston whispered. "Nobody does," Noah replied. "It just becomes easier to agree one day." The road waited. It always waits. And Winston understood. From now on, there would only be one of two options. Either he would be the one passing the road on, or the one it would tear apart for trying to leave. He looked at Noah, and for the first time in a long time, he thought not of the road, but of the fear of staying forever. And the road didn't expect this fear. Winston and Noah stood opposite each other for too long. This wasn't human silence. It was the expectation of a system accustomed to decisions being made faster. The air around them grew thick, as if the night had begun to thicken prematurely. The stars overhead looked wrong, too bright, too close, as if they were watching. "You feel it, don't you?" Noah said quietly. "When the road leans toward you." Winston nodded. There was no point in denying it. "She's already chosen," Noah continued. "The only question is whether you consciously agree." "And if I don't agree?" Winston asked. Noah looked away. "Then she'll take you completely, without a trace." It was at that moment that Winston realized. Aaron hadn't left because he'd found a way out. Earl hadn't stayed because he wanted to help. They were all going to the same stage, the moment when resistance becomes more dangerous than submission. The road began to change space. Not abruptly, imperceptibly. It did it in such a way that a person doubted their own feelings. The asphalt ahead seemed to lengthen. The horizon receded. A light flickered in the distance. Not headlights, not a city, but something in between. That's the transmission point, Noah said. Not everyone can see it. What's there? Winston asked. Silence, Noah answered. The kind that makes ordinary life seem noisy and wrong. They walked together. Winston didn't remember when he got out of the car. He didn't remember how long they walked. At some point, he realized he couldn't hear his own footsteps. Only strangers, as if someone was walking beside him, but not keeping pace. In the light ahead, others stood. Not people, not entirely. Figures in which the outlines of those who had once ridden were discernible. A man in a road service jacket, a woman with a key without a fob, a guy with a notebook. Their faces would. Are they calm? Freed? They're not resisting anymore. Noah said, they feel better. One of them took a step forward. Winston recognized Aaron, or his uniform. You held out long, he said. That's rare. You could have warned me, Winston replied. Aaron shook his head. We did warn you. You just heard us as accidents. The light grew brighter. Winston felt his memories begin to shift, to form into a strange order. He saw roads he had never taken. He heard the voices of people he had never met. But the scariest thing was, they felt like his own. Tell them, someone said behind him. Say the right words. Winston realized, if he spoke now, the process would be complete. He would become the entry point. He would no longer be the person riding. He would become the one through whom others rode. He looked at Noah. Do you know what will happen next? Winston asked. Yes, he replied. I will stop being lost, and you will stop being yourself. It was honest, and that makes it even scarier. At that moment, Winston did something no one expected of him. He fell silent. He didn't say a word. He didn't justify himself. He didn't agree. He didn't refuse. And for the first time, the road became confused. The silence became wrong. The figures around him began to stir. The light wavered, because the system was built on choice, not on pause, on words, on acceptance. Speak, the road whispered inside him. You have to. Winston closed his eyes and, for the first time on the entire journey, thought not about how to get out, but about how to break the rhythm. If you're holding on to us agreeing, he said quietly, what will happen if we simply stop answering? The light began to dim. Noah looked at him in horror. You don't understand, he said. If you do this, I understand, Winston answered. I will stop being useful. And that was the worst thing a road could do. She didn't scream. She released the pressure. The figures began to disappear, not dying, but losing shape. Space collapsed like an exhalation. Winston fell to his knees and felt the ground, real, cold, rough. When he raised his head, Noah was standing a few meters away, alive, confused. What now? He asked. Winston didn't answer right away. He looked at the road. It was still there, but she was no longer looking directly at him. Now, Winston said, you decide for yourself. And somewhere far away, in the Texas darkness, the road began to search for another voice. After the light went out and the figures dissolved, the world didn't return to normal. It became unstable. Winston felt it immediately. As soon as he tried to stand, the ground beneath his feet was solid, but the distances around him behaved strangely. A step forward sometimes took a second, sometimes an eternity. Noah stood nearby, silent, as if afraid to disturb something fragile again. She didn't leave. Noah said finally, she just stopped talking. Winston nodded. It was worse than a voice. They walked together. The road no longer prompted, pulled, or pressed, but that was precisely what made it dangerous. It had become indifferent, and indifference in places like this meant one thing. The system was rebuilding. After a few miles, they saw light. Real light. Not flickering. Not in between. Just lanterns. A small town with a sign called Haven Rock. The name was embossed on the metal, as if they were afraid to paint it. "I don't remember this place," Winston said. "Because it didn't exist before," Noah answered. "There were people in the town. Real people, tired, noisy, irritated. But there was something else, too. They were all guarding something. Some were guarding a house. Some the street. Some just the stretch of road in front of them. They watched intently, as if waiting for the world to drift again. A woman named Ruth met them. She was old but not weak. In her gaze there was a knowledge one did not want to have. "So it's you," she said to Winston, "the one who silenced the road." "I didn't mean to." "No one does," Ruth interrupted. "But now you brought her here." "Here where?" "To a place where she was never supposed to appear again." Ruth explained to them that Haven Rock was a pocket, a place that once fell off the route. The people here didn't leave and didn't stay. They froze between. Once upon a time, a man like Winston also refused to speak, and the road lost him. Since then, she's been looking for a way to regain control. "You upset the balance," Ruth said. "It doesn't replace anymore. It copies." This became clear that same night. Winston woke up to the sound of footsteps and his own words. Outside the window, someone spoke in his voice, slowly, calmly, with the same intonation he used when directing people. "If you're tired, keep going. If in doubt, don't stop." A man stood on the street. He resembled Winston not in his face, but in his essence, his movements, his posture, the pauses in his speech. "It wasn't me," Noah whispered. "No," Winston replied. "It's worse." By morning, there were more of these guides. One at the entrance to the city, another at the gas station. They weren't alive and they weren't dead. They were a function torn from him. "The road can't make you talk," Ruth said, "but she can talk to you." Another man appeared in Haven Rock. Silas. He was young, nervous, and kept looking back. "I followed the voice," he admitted. "It sounded right. Calm. It said it knew the way." Winston realized it was one of his reflections. "You have to leave," Winston said. "And you, I have to stay long enough to stop this." Noah looked at him with horror. "You said it yourself. If you stay, you'll become a part." "I already have," Winston answered. "Just not completely." At night, the city began to shrink. The streets grew shorter, the houses closer. People felt it and locked their doors. Winston's reflections walked between the houses, repeating his old phrases, but more and more often they were wrong. Sometimes they spoke too late, sometimes too early. The road was learning, and Winston realized a terrible thing. His silence had broken the old system, but created a new, cruder one. To stop her, he had to make a choice worse than compliance. He had to reclaim his voice, but in a way that no longer belonged to the road. And somewhere on the outskirts of Haven Rock stood the man who could do it, a man who never heard the road, and therefore was invisible to her. His name was Jacob, and it was with him that everything would truly begin. Jacob lived on the outskirts of Haven Rock in a small house that looked as if it had been built not for protection, but for stubbornness. The house stood crooked. The fence was half broken, but all around there was a strange silence, pure, unforced, unsuspecting. Winston sensed it even before he came closer. The road here breathed not. "He doesn't hear her," Ruth said quietly. "Never heard her." Jacob turned out to be an ordinary-looking man in his 30s, with a tired face and attentive eyes. He didn't flinch when Winston and Noah approached, didn't tense up, didn't glance back at the road. "You're not from around here," he said calmly. "We don't know any more," Winston answered. "Then come in." Jacob nodded. It's better to talk inside. There was no radio in the house. No television. There wasn't even a clock. Winston immediately realized there was nothing to pick up a signal here. Ruth said you were special, Winston began. Jacob chuckled. She says that about everyone who hasn't broken down. But in short, yes, I don't hear what others hear. Never heard. Even when you're driving alone on an empty highway. Noah asked. Especially then, Jacob answered. For me, it's just a road. The word sounded like a blow. Winston realized that this was precisely why the road couldn't reach him. No response. No dialogue. No entry point. We need your help, Winston said. But it could cost you everything. Jacob looked straight at him. Then tell me honestly, are you still human? The question wasn't an accusation. It was a test. Winston thought for a moment, and for the first time in a long time, he answered honestly, I'm not sure. Jacob nodded. Then perhaps I can still help. That night, Winston's reflections approached Haven Rock. There were more of them. They moved more confidently, spoke more precisely. The road adapted, and the city felt it. The walls of the houses began to float. The distances between them shrank. She's using you as a template, said Ruth. As long as you exist, she will copy. Then we need to remove the template, said Noah. But if Winston disappears, she will win, Jacob answered quietly, because disappearance is also a form of submission. Winston realized that there were 3 options, and all were bad. Remain and become completely a function. Disappear and give the road everything it wants. Or do what it cannot predict. You must transmit the voice, said Jacob, not to the road, and not to people, but to the void. Is that possible? Asked Noah. Yes, answered Jacob. But after that, you will no longer be whole. Towards morning, Winston left the city. The reflections stood along the road, silently. They no longer tried to persuade. They waited, as if they were waiting for the inevitable. Jacob walked beside him. The road didn't react. It didn't feel Jacob, and that made him the most dangerous creature for it. When I say so, Jacob said quietly, you must speak. Say everything, but not like before. How? As if no one is listening to you. That was the scariest thing. Winston stood in the middle of the road, closed his eyes, and began to speak, not to people, not to the road, simply into space. He spoke of fear, of doubt, of how he wanted to be sure, how he wanted someone to tell him that everything was right. He spoke uncertainly, faltering, breaking the rhythm. The reflections began to tremble. The road lost shape. She didn't understand that voice. It didn't lead. It didn't direct. It didn't promise a way out. Go on, Jacob whispered. She can't use something that doesn't have a purpose. Winston spoke for a long time, until his voice became hoarse, until the words turned into fragments of thoughts. And then the road retreated, didn't disappear, but went blind. When it was all over, Winston sat on the asphalt. Empty, he felt lighter, and at the same time, incomplete. You did it, Noah said. Are you free? Winston looked up. No, he replied. But I don't belong to her now. Haven Rock remains, reflected, and disappeared. The road became just a road again, at least here. Jacob returned to his house. Ruth continued guarding the town. Noah drove away, on a real highway, with a real map. And Winston remained on the side of the road, looking at the horizon. He knew the road will not forget. But now it does not have his voice. And sometimes that is enough for the world to begin to breathe again. After that night, Winston Brown stopped feeling the road the way he used to. It no longer responded inside him with a pressure or a whisper, but that did not mean it was gone. It was like hearing loss. The world continues to sound, You just are no longer sure you hear everything. He stayed in Haven Rock longer than planned. Day followed night, without a clear rhythm. The sun rose and set, but time felt like a blur. Sometimes Winston caught himself sitting in the same place for hours, thinking about nothing in particular, and there was something unsettling in this peace. "It's normal," Ruth said when she noticed his condition. "You were a pressure point for a long time. Now it's gone. The world needs to get used to it." "And for me?" Winston asked. Ruth looked at him carefully. "It's more difficult for you. You still remember who you were to her." Sometimes Winston saw people coming into town and leaving without incident. It pleased and frightened him at the same time. So the road really was blind here. But Winston felt it was learning to go around. A few days later, a new man appeared in Haven Rock. His name was Peter. He arrived alone, without luggage, without confusion. He simply stopped at the edge of town and looked at the houses for a long time, as if checking something inside himself. "He's dangerous," Ruth said quietly, "not because he can hear the road, but because it doesn't interest him." Peter spoke little. He asked strange questions. Who's in charge here? What happens if no one's watching? Who decides when enough is enough? Winston felt an unpleasant recognition. These were not the questions of traveler. These were the questions of an observer. "You were part of something big," Peter said to Winston one evening. "I can see it in the way you look. You don't look for a way. You evaluate." "It's a habit," Winston replied. "Habits are the vestiges of old roles," Peter said. "They rarely disappear." That same night, Winston felt a familiar sensation, faint, distant. Pressure, not from within, from without, as if someone were carefully testing the boundaries of Haven Rock. "She found a way around it," Jacob said when Winston told him about it. "Not through you, through structure." "What does that mean?" "Before, the road needed a voice. Now it seeks form." The next morning, one of the houses in town was slightly closer to the next one than it had been the day before. Just a little, almost imperceptibly. But Ruth noticed. "She's compressing space," she said. "If she can't speak, she will press." People started sleeping worse. The dreams became the same, a long road disappearing into the fog, and the feeling that if you stop, you will be found. Children woke up screaming, although they had never heard the road before. "It calls not with words," said Winston. "It creates inconvenience, anxiety, the desire to leave. And then people themselves come to it," nodded Jacob. Peter disappeared on the third day. No one saw him leave. His house stood empty, the door open. On the table lay a piece of paper with a neatly written phrase. "If the system breaks, it must be replaced, not fixed." "He didn't leave," said Ruth. "He entered." That night, Winston heard the road again. Not a voice, not a whisper. His own name, spoken without intonation, like a mark. He walked outside the city alone. The asphalt was cold, almost alive. In the distance stood a figure, not a reflection, not a copy. Something new. "You no longer speak for me," said the figure, "but you still understand me." "I won't," Winston said. "Never again." The figure bowed its head. "Then you will be the one who watches," it replied, "until another is found." And Winston understood. The road had not disappeared. It had changed its strategy. Now it didn't need a guide. It needed a witness. And the worst thing was that Winston knew that he couldn't give that up either, because if no one was watching, it would be everywhere again. He returned to Haven Rock in the early morning. Jacob silently opened the door for him. Ruth was already waiting. "Did she choose you again?" she asked. Winston nodded slowly. "Not as a voice," he said, "as a memory." And that was worse. After Winston realized that he'd become a witness, and not a voice, The world began to behave cautiously. Not better. Precisely cautiously, as if someone were moving around a room knowing they were being watched. The road no longer pushed or pulled. It was present, like a thought that you can't get rid of if you know it exists. Winston never traveled far from Haven Rock again. He would walk to the edge of town, stand on the asphalt, look into the distance, and wait. Not for people, but for changes. Sometimes the road was ordinary. Sometimes it wasn't. At those moments, the air became too smooth, and the sound seemed to lose depth. "You become a boundary," Ruth said one day. "Not a wall, not a door, just a place where something stops." "And if I—" "Walking?" Winston asked. Ruth was silent for a long time. "Then there will be no border." He began to notice that the people around him behaved differently. They didn't come close, didn't look directly into his eyes. Even Jacob, who never heard the road, sometimes lingered his gaze on Winston, as if checking if he was still there. The dreams became rare, but heavy. In them, Winston walked along a road that was completely empty. No signs, no horizon, only asphalt and the feeling that if he stopped, the world would stop moving. He woke up without sweat, without screaming, but with the firm knowledge these were not just dreams. A few weeks later, a child was born in Haven Rock. He was brought by a woman who looked exhausted to the limit. "He doesn't speak," she said, "but he looks where there is no one." Winston crouched down in front of the boy. The child looked past him, straight at the road behind Winston. "He sees you," Jacob said quietly. "No," Winston answered. "He sees it through me." This was the first sign of a new stage. The road no longer copied, called, or pressed. It grew, through glances, through silence, through the feeling that somewhere there's a path you didn't choose. But it still exists. "You can't be a witness forever," said Ruth. "Even stone wears away over time." "Then who will watch?" Winston asked. "The one who doesn't yet understand that they are watching," she answered. And Winston understood the road was looking again, not for a replacement, an heir. He began to notice such people, not right away. They were distinguished not by fear or confusion, but by a strange attentiveness. They looked longer at empty spaces. Sometimes they stopped for no reason. Sometimes they asked questions that Winston used to answer himself. One of them was a girl named Elena. She arrived alone, but did not look lonely. "It's peaceful here," she said, looking around Haven Rock. "But this is not peace. This is a pause." Winston felt a chill. He had spoken these words himself once, but not out loud. "Have you been on the road long?" he asked. "All my life," Elena answered. "I just used to think I was going somewhere." She couldn't hear the road, but she felt the voids between decisions. It was precisely such people who were the most dangerous and the most needed. That night, Winston walked out of the city again. The road was dark, calm. The figure didn't appear right away. Not ahead, next to him. "You teach them," said the road. "I'm just watching," Winston answered. "Watching is also an influence." "I won't pass this on," he said. The road didn't respond. But Winston felt the space shift, not in his direction, toward Elena. And then he understood the road no longer asks permission. It simply waits until you get tired of holding your gaze. Winston returned to the city with a heaviness in his chest. Jacob was sitting on the porch of his house. "It's moving," said Jacob. "Yes," answered Winston, slowly, "through those who don't want to go." "And what will you do?" Winston looked at the city, at the people, at the light in the windows. "I'll stay," he said, "as long as I can." And then Winston fell silent. "Then I hope that the world will learn to look on its own." That night Elena didn't sleep. She sat by the window and looked at the road. not because she was drawn to it, but because she wanted to understand. And Winston understood this is the beginning of the end, not a catastrophe, but a transmission that cannot be stopped, but can be slowed down because the road is patient and fear is not. The first changes were almost imperceptible. Small things began to disappear in Haven Rock. Road signs, mailboxes, old street signs. No one saw how it happened. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been there. People noticed it only after the fact, when they could not remember what exactly was missing. It erases landmarks, said Ruth. If a man doesn't know where he is, the road is always near. Winston felt it as a dull ache somewhere behind his eyes. Not pressure, not a voice, an emptiness that was expanding. He began to see the world differently, not as objects, but as connections between them. Where a connection disappeared, a road appeared. One morning, Jacob came to him with an anxious expression. "There's a new path in town," he said. "It wasn't there last night." They went beyond the outskirts of Haven Rock and saw a narrow strip of packed earth leading off into the desert. No asphalt, no signs. Just a path that had already been walked. "People don't remember walking along it," Jacob added. "But there are tracks." Winston crouched down and touched the ground. It was warm. "It's not a road," he said. "It's a habit." That same day, quarrels began in town. People argued over trivial matters. Who was going where? Who said what? Who was supposed to watch whom? They had one thing in common. Everyone was sure the others were wrong. The road no longer pulled them together. It divided them. Elena began to change. She left alone more and more often, returning silent with an absent gaze. Winston tried not to look at her too closely, but he felt she was already standing too close to the border. "You see it, right?" she asked one day. "How everything here diverges." "I see," Winston replied. "That's why we can't go any further." "And yes, is there more to come? The only place where everything comes together again?" Elena said quietly. These words were new. Not roads. Human. And that made them even more dangerous. That night, Haven Rock experienced its first real distortion. One of the houses ended up inside another. Not destroyed, not broken, combined. The people who lived there didn't notice anything strange until they tried to go out in different directions and found themselves in the same corridor. "It compresses the space of choice," Winston said. "It makes it so that there's only one path." "And where does it lead?" Jacob asked. Winston didn't answer. He already knew. The next day, a new man appeared, Mason. He arrived not along the road, but from it. There was no car nearby. He simply stood on the path outside of town, as if he had been placed there. "I was looking for a place where I could stop deciding," Mason said. "I was told that such a thing exists here." "Who said that?" Winston asked. Mason thought about it. "I don't remember," he answered honestly. But it sounded convincing. It was new. The road no longer used Winston. It was learning to persuade itself. Ruth looked afraid for the first time. "If people start coming here voluntarily," she said, without finishing the thought. "Haven Rock will stop being a pocket," Winston finished. "It will become a hub, and then the road will win." That night, Winston reached the edge of town again. The road appeared not as a figure or voice. It was a sense of direction that required no explanation. "I don't need you any more," it said wordlessly. "You have become an obstacle." For the first time, Winston wasn't afraid. "You are wrong," he said aloud. "I have become time." The road didn't understand. And that was an opportunity. The next day, Winston gathered the people. He didn't explain. He didn't convince. He did what the road hated most. He taught them to doubt together. People began to talk, listen, test. The path outside town stopped widening. The house no longer changed shape. Mason stayed, but started asking questions. Elena looked at Winston for a long time. Then she looked away. "You didn't stop it," she said. "You just made it slow." "Sometimes that's enough," he replied. But that night, Winston realized the road hadn't retreated. It had moved on to the next stage. Somewhere beyond Haven Rock, another city had appeared, exactly the same, only without Winston, and that meant the game had gotten bigger. Winston didn't immediately realize the existence of the second city. At first, it was rumors. People in Haven Rock began to say that somewhere further in the desert there was a place very similar to their city, with the same houses, the same streets, even with the same people, almost the same, as they said hesitantly. "That's impossible," said Ruth. "Not for the road," Winston replied. He felt it on his skin. Space was cloning like a thought repeated too many times. The road no longer built slowly. It replicated a successful solution. The first to see the second town was Mason. He left at night along the trail and returned in the morning pale with dilated pupils. "Everything is simpler there," he said. "No one doubts. No one argues. People know where to go." "And where?" asked Winston. Mason fell silent. "Where it becomes quiet inside." This was the most dangerous description of all. Winston went on his own, not because he wanted to, but because he understood. If he didn't look, the road would show this place to others, and then it would be too late. The journey took less time than it should have. Space compressed again, and suddenly he found himself on the outskirts of a town that was all too familiar. The same houses, the same layout. Even the smell of the air was similar, but there was a difference. There was no Haven Rock here. There was no pocket here. Here everything was aflow. People moved calmly, without haste, but also without hesitation. They did not look back. They did not ask questions. Everyone had a route, not a navigator, not a map, but an inner knowledge of where they were going and where they were going. And then Winston saw him, a man standing by the main street. Calm, confident. He spoke to people without raising his voice, without convincing. He simply confirmed their decisions. "You've arrived," the man said when Winston approached. "I knew it." "Who are you?" Winston asked, although the answer was obvious. "The one who agreed," he replied. "My name is Peter." Winston felt a chill run through him. "You disappeared into Haven Rock." "No," Peter said softly. "I've moved on to a place where doubts are no longer needed. That's not freedom. Freedom is a fatigue of choice," Peter replied. "You're just afraid to admit it. In this city, the road wasn't hidden. It was the norm. It didn't break people. It simplified them. And that's why the place was so stable." "You're still in the way," Peter said. "While you watch, the world remembers that it can be different. And you became its voice?" Winston asked. Peter shook his head. "I became its result. And there will be more like it." Winston realized something terrible. The road no longer needed one guide. It had learned to distribute itself. Every person who gave up doubt became a part of it. When Winston returned to Haven Rock, he saw that the town had changed. People had become quieter. They looked more often. They headed toward the path. Some began to say phrases he had heard before, not from the road, but from another city. Elena stood at the edge of the street and looked into the distance. "You saw him," she said. "Yes." "And he's right." "He's convenient," Winston replied. "And that's always more dangerous than being right." That night, Winston understood. Being a witness was no longer enough. Doubting was insufficient. Slowing down was temporary. The road had reached a level where it didn't impose itself. It offered relief, and it was impossible to fight this directly. Winston sat at the edge of the city and for the first time, admitted a thought that made him shudder. Perhaps the road couldn't be stopped. It could only be made difficult. And that meant the most terrible decision of all awaited him. To break not the system, but the idea of convenience. And somewhere between the two cities, a third place was already appearing, still without a name, still without a witness. But not for long. Winston understood that a third place existed even before he saw it. He felt like the tension between Haven Rock and Peter City, a knot about to tighten, not a point or a stream, but a transition, a place where people stop not because they're lost, but because they've decided not to decide anymore. The first ones came at night, not in a crowd, but one at a time. They didn't ask if they could stay. They simply sat by the road, stared ahead, and waited. When Winston tried to speak to them, they responded politely but emptily, as if conversation were something superfluous. "It's peaceful here," they said. "Nothing demands here." This was a new level of danger. The road no longer led. It was lifting the weight. Ruth was the first to break, not outwardly, but internally. "I'm tired of being on guard," she told Winston. "All my life I've maintained the boundary. But what if the boundary is also a form of violence?" Winston found no answer, because there was no lie in her words, only weariness. Jacob noticed a change before the others. He said it simply. People are starting to disappear not from the world. They are disappearing from themselves. The third place grew quickly. Not a city, a space of agreement. There were no houses there, but there were fires. There were no streets, but there were directions that no one named. People sat next to each other, but did not talk. They smiled, not joyfully, but with relief. Winston went there alone. He saw Elena among them. She was sitting on the ground, looking at the fire, and looked calm. "You don't look any more," he said. "I look differently," she answered. I stopped resisting. "It's not you speaking," Winston said. Elena turned to him. "Are you sure it's you still speaking?" The question was more terrible than any voice on the road. In the center of the space stood a man, not Peter. Another, his name was Samuel. He did not direct or confirm. He allowed. "You are not an enemy," Samuel said to Winston. "You just can't let go." "Let go of what?" "Yourself," Samuel answered calmly. "You keep the world in suspense. And we offer it rest." "At the cost of what?" "At the cost of choice," Samuel said. "But choice is pain. Not everyone has to endure it." Winston understood. The road had evolved. It no longer needed routes. It offered surrender without defeat. And people agreed. When Winston returned to Haven Rock, the town had become smaller. Not physically, but in meaning. People began to leave. Not disappear, but shift. Jacob remained. Ruth hesitated. Mason left completely. "If this continues," Jacob said, "the only ones left are those who cannot let go, and that is a poor foundation for peace." That night, Winston understood that he could no longer simply watch. If he remained a witness, the road would win. If he became a voice, he would lose. There was only one option left, and it chilled him inside. He had to distort the very idea of the road. Not stop it, not break it, but make it so that it no longer promised anything. To do this, Winston had to go where no one had gone before, to a place where the road begins but has not yet taken shape. And in this place, he would have to do the most terrible thing. Not choose, not agree, but make a deliberate mistake. Because the road cannot live with mistakes. It can only live with decisions. And somewhere in the darkness of Texas, a point was already appearing where even the direction did not yet know where it was leading. Winston headed there. Winston walked where there was no road. It was difficult to explain even to himself. He did not turn, did not choose a direction, did not navigate by the stars. He simply stopped looking for a way. and the world began to thin around him. The ground beneath his feet remained solid, but distances lost their meaning. A step could last a second or an eternity. He was no longer sure whether he was moving forward or staying in place. This was the beginning. There was no wind here. There was no silence. There was an absence of the need for sound. Winston realized that he was in a space where the road had not yet become a road, where it was an intention, not by desire, not by will, by the intention to exist. People appeared, not of flesh and not ghosts. They looked like outlines that someone didn't finish drawing. Winston felt, these are those who stopped too soon, too deep. Those who agreed not to go further and not in, to return. There is no pain here, they said, not out loud. There is no choice here. Then there is no life here either, Winston answered. The figures did not object. Objection would have required effort. For the first time, he saw the road as it really was, not a ribbon of asphalt, not a direction, not a voice, but an algorithm of simplification. It was not evil, not intelligent in the usual sense. It simply sought to remove friction, to make the world smooth, to make man comfortable. You should not have come here, said the road. Now without form, without a mask. You are a mistake of the previous version. That is precisely why I am here, Winston answered. He felt the past and the future begin to close. The road tried to understand him, classify him, integrate him. But Winston did not give it support. He did not argue. He did not resist. He did what the system did not take into account. He began to make mistakes. He took a step back when he should have gone forward. He fell silent when an answer was expected. He agreed and then changed his mind for no reason. He named things incorrectly. He confused cause and effect. Space trembled. You're breaking coherence, said the road. Without it, everything falls apart. Yes, said Winston. Sometimes it's necessary. He remembered everyone he'd met. Ruth, Jacob, Elena, even Peter. They weren't evil. They were tired. The road simply offered them a form of peace. And then Winston took the final step, the most terrible. He renounced the meaning of his action. He stopped being against, stopped being for. He stopped being the solution. At that moment, the road went completely blind. It didn't disappear. It didn't collapse. It lost its direction. Space began to return, slowly, unevenly, with mistakes. Extra paths appeared, unnecessary turns, alleys leading to nowhere. The world became complex again. Winston fell to the ground and lay there for a long time, not knowing how much time had passed. When he got up, there was a desert around him, a real one, with wind, with cold, with imperfection. He walked back for a long time. When he returned to Haven Rock, the city was still standing. People were there, not all of them, but those who remained talked loudly, argued, made mistakes. Some were crying, some were angry, and that was good. Jacob sat by his house and smiled for the first time in a long time. She no longer knows where to lead, he said. She will learn, Winston answered. Yes, Jacob nodded, but now it will be difficult for her. Elena was gone, not to a third city, not with the flow. She simply left, without confidence, without direction. And Winston understood, this is victory. He himself no longer felt the road, not even as a background, not even as a shadow. But sometimes, very rarely, he caught himself with a strange thought. If he stopped making mistakes, if he wanted simplicity again, if he decided he knew better, the road might remember. And so Winston did the only thing that guaranteed then his role. He moved on into a world where no one knew his story and where every day demanded new mistakes. Because a path isn't something that leads. It's something where you can get lost and still remain human. Years passed, not so long that everything was forgotten, and not so short that everything became legend. Winston Brown lived in places where the roads were ordinary, with potholes, traffic lights, dead ends, and people who swore at traffic jams. He deliberately chose cities without horizons, the kind where your gaze always rests on buildings, signs, windows. It's harder to think about directions there. He didn't tell his story, not because he was afraid, but because he felt that if he said out loud, it would become a convenient form again. And convenience is the first step back. Sometimes, very rarely, he felt something strange. Not a call, not pressure, more like an echo, as if somewhere far away someone was trying to straighten the world again, to make it smooth, simple, understandable. One day on the bus, he overheard two teenagers talking. "I wish someone would just tell me where to go." One said, "Yes," answered the second, "so that there are no more eternal doubts." Winston didn't intervene. He only turned to the window and felt a familiar chill. Not fear, but recognition. That same night, he had a dream. Not a road, not a desert, a city, an ordinary city. But there were no crossroads, only straight lines. People walked calmly, without stopping. No one stumbled. No one made mistakes. And that's why the dream was unbearable. He woke up with one thought. The road isn't dead. It's waiting for time, not people. A few days later, Winston met a man he'd never seen before, and immediately realized he'd seen it all too well. The man was standing outside a bookstore, looking at a city map printed on an advertising poster. "It's strange," he said, noticing Winston's gaze. "I always think there must be a more correct way somewhere." "And if there isn't one?" asked Winston. The man shrugged. Then, probably, someone hadn't shown it yet. This phrase was dangerous, not because it contained a road, but because it contained an expectation. Winston left without continuing the conversation. He knew his role was no longer to answer. His role was not to become the answer. In another city, in another state, Jacob once noticed a strange thing. On old maps, little lines began to appear. Lines, notrads, batterisomtrans. They let naur, baduer marked, as if someone had decided there might be a pet there. Rood diet pisvrli. Before she did, she set only one thing. The word is noisy again. So everything is all right. Yelena never returned. Sometimes Winston thought that this was her real choice to disappear not into the road, but into possibilities. And Heaven Rock, a remained, not a city or a pocket, just a place where people sometimes stop and don't know why. Then they argue, then they make mistakes, then they move on. Sometimes Winston imagines their chess scenario, that one day the road would return not as a pad, but as a device, as an algorithm, as a conception built into the word. And then one would notice that they had stopped choosing again. So Winston did the only thing he knew best. He lived there unevenly. He changed Deutsch's mind. He made mistakes in public. He said, "I don't know, moreover than, I'm sure." And every time he wanted simplicity, he chose polygzity, not out of heroism, but from memory, because he knew the road is begin with his foot or the dessert. It begins the moment a person says, "Let someone else decide for me to." And as long as that deism becomes a norm, the word can still be Soviet. The last thing Winston Brown understood about the road didn't come to him suddenly. It isn't a revelation or a flash. It was a core knowledge that develops over the years, when you live among people long enough and see how they make decisions. He was sitting in a small cafe on the outskirts of an ordinary city. It was raining outside. People were arguing over trivia. Someone was late. Someone got the wrong address. Someone took the wrong street and was now arguing on the phone. The word was uneven, noisy, and alive. And Winston understood. The road hadn't returned. It hadn't disappeared, but it hadn't returned either. Because to return, it didn't need space or a route. It needed consent. Mass, coherent, convenient, and it wasn't there. People still wanted simplicity. They wanted someone to tell them what was right. But now this was moreover met with doubt. Vis distrust, vis irritation, and that was enough. Winston no longer felt like a boundary, a weakness, or a memory. He had become what he had always been, but allowed himself to be for a long time a man without a role. He could make mistakes without explaining why. He could live without leaving a trace. He could remain silent when an answer was expected of him. Sometimes it seemed to him that if he listened very carefully, he would hear a familiar silence. But he didn't listen. This was important. The last time the road made itself known in its most ordinary form. One day, Winston saw a boy standing at a crossroads, looking round in confusion. The navigator on HES phone shot two routes at once and saw and choose. "Uncle, which way should I go?" the boy asked. Winston looked at the crossroads. "Ten at the boy, ten at the sky." "I don't know," he said uneasily. "TRY1. If you don't like it, come back to it." The boy thought for a moment. He nodded, and he walked on hesitantly, but on which he on. Winston stood there for a few more seconds. He felt no relief, no victory. He felt only a wearycom. And that was enough. Because the road is live word here is a pet. IT lives word here is no choice. And as long as people choose badly, strangely, mistakenly, but on their own it remains just an opportunity, not a destiny. Winston Brown moved on, not into the desert, not into the unknown, simply into life, and that was the only ending the road saw on the right. Many years later, no one remembered the strange places where people got lost without knowing why. Maps became more accurate, navigators smarter, earthwise more intrusive. The world was once again trying to simplify, as a tia always does. But something didn't quite work out this time. Sometimes the algorithms were wrong. Sometimes their routes contradicted each other. Sometimes people got angry, argued, and chose a wrong. And each such glitch was a small victory that no one knew about. Winston Brown became as ordinary as by cerebral. He grew old, changed their cities, forgot faces. The rad's history was erased not by magic, but by time. And that was the most reliable method. In rare moments, when the world suddenly became too smooth to luggage out, to correct Winston felt a slight uneasiness. Then he would do something simple and wrong. Change plans at the last minute, walk without reason, say, "I don't know," instead of, "It's supposed to be this way," and the world began to breathe again. No one came for him. No one asked for a replacement. No one was waiting by the side of the road anymore, because the road never learned to live without consent, and consent was no longer free. When Winston did quietly, without witnesses, without meaning nothing happened. The world did not waver. Space did not collapse. The road did not repair. This was the main proof that everything ended well. Sometimes, somewhere, a person still asks, "Where should I go?" And sometimes they answer him, "Decide for yourself to." And as long as the answer exists, the road remains just a word.